It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, what is up, everyone? Scott back with you, bringing you another episode of the Audio Skills Podcast. We've got a dynamite show for you where we're going to be talking about making home recording and mixing easier. Helping me to do this will be David Vignola, founder of homerecordingmadeeasy.com. But before we dive into that, it's time for your audio tip of the week. My tip this week is this. Organization is the key to success. Whether you are producing, mixing, or mastering, whether you're just creating for yourself or working for clients, being organized is crucial. So many of us creative types have struggles with this. I myself have had a lot of challenges staying organized. So don't worry if you struggle, but some things that you can do to get a better handle on it are as follows. Number one, come up with a file naming system that makes sense and is easy to follow, and then stick to it. Basically, avoid putting things like project version final, or project version final, or project version final in your file names. Use numbers to keep track of versions. Create folders that are logically named and easy to store your projects, sounds and samples and all that. Make use of tools in your DAW for labeling tracks, groups, and setting other color schemes. That's the second thing. Label parts of your arrangement, where the chorus is, where the verses are. Get rid of unwanted or unused tracks and move them to the bottom, out of the way. Things like this will add up and help you not get lost while you're in your project, while you're in your DAW working. And number three, if you are trying to take on clients, or really if you just want to manage your recording and mixing better, use a calendar app like Google Calendar to keep track of things and keep yourself accountable. So if you are trying to record or mix, use your calendar app and say, okay, on Wednesday at 7, I am going to do this. Or if you are taking clients, be like, okay, I need to deliver these files by Thursday at noon. That is the kind of thing that will keep you driving forward and keep you effective and organized. You know, when it comes to mixing and producing music from home, you are your own boss. And so everything you can do to keep yourself organized will make it all go much more smoothly. Don't let a lack of organization lead to frustration, or worse, losing the motivation to finish a project or finishing it poorly because you were lost. All right, that's enough on organization, but that is your audio tip of the week. So now I am very pleased to introduce David Vignola, audio pro and founder of homerecordingmadeeasy.com, as well as learningtomix.com, which are sites that help people learn how to record and mix music from home and get great results doing it. He's going to be sharing some of his best recording and mixing advice with us today, showing us how to make it easy. David, welcome to the show, man.
Well, thanks, Scott, for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time and letting me on your show. This is awesome.
Right on. How's your 2018 been treating you so far?
So far, so good. Busy, which is always good, right? So, it's a good thing. So, it's been really busy.
Excellent. Well, to start us off, could you just tell us a little bit more about your career in audio and the kind of projects and things you're doing today?
Yeah, I mean, my career in audio started back probably in the mid-90s when I first started getting into the whole recording world. And the way I got started is probably like many people listening. I'm a musician. I'm a guitar player and played in bands, most of my life. And I was the guy that learned how to hook up the PA, and read all all the manuals and wanted the band to sound good live. And back in those days, it was just kind of starting to break where you were able to, record your band. You wanted to record your band live and having those kind of multi-track digital players, and they were still very expensive, but that was just kind of coming into the fold. And I wanted to learn how to record my band because I wanted to just just have it as like a moment, like a memento. So when I'm old and gray sitting in a rocking chair, I can show my my kids, your dad used to play in a band and here's what
Yeah.
he sounded like. And so
Right. Yeah.
that started the journey of me learning how to record music. I had no clue. I didn't go to audio school. I didn't do any of that stuff. And I started back then in learning and just learning on my own and everything from, buying a machine and reading the manuals to when YouTube started to break and become big, getting on YouTube and watching a billion videos like you and everyone else that's listening it does.
Yep.
And I taught myself for the first couple of years how to do that. And then once I got that bug, and I realized that, my skills as a guitar player were were limited, and making money making music and playing in a band was probably not gonna be my path. But I got the bug of the whole technical side and the gear and how to record and make things sound good, and so I was able to find in Connecticut, where I'm from, a couple local studios which are no longer in business, unfortunately. And they took me in as like kind of an apprentice, if you will, where I'd work there for free, and I was really fortunate to work with some local engineers that were really good, that really taught me from the ground up. I didn't have to go through your typical apprentice where I'm getting coffee and scrubbing bathroom floors. I never had to do any of that stuff. I just made friends with one of the engineers, and he taught me a whole lot about all the basics. And that kind of is how it started. And then from there, it was just working in different studios around my state as an apprentice, eventually becoming a recording engineer prior to a mixing engineer. That's how I started. I didn't start as mixing. I started more as a recording engineer, capturing, recordings.
Sure.
And that kind of led to over several years in the early 2000s to then learning how to mix and what that all meant, and not really understanding what that was.
Yeah.
And in 2000 and I want to say 2007, 2008, after working in 2 or 3 studios and kind of learning the mixing craft, learning the recording craft, working with lots of local bands, I bought a home with my wife we bought a home that had a completely about a 900 square foot unfinished basement with 8.5 foot ceilings, which is pretty rare for basements.
Yeah.
With the sole purpose of, I knew I wanted to build a studio and I wanted to start my own little business for no other reason other than to make a couple of bucks on the side as some like disposable income so I could buy some cool guitars,
Yeah.
And I was doing that from 2007 when we built our studio until about 2010, 2011 as a part-time business while I was working a full-time job, doing it on nights, doing it on the weekends. And there was never a weekend that went by where I didn't have a band in this studio. And a lot of it was just learning as I was going. I had some of that formal training in the studios, as I mentioned, but then a lot of it was just getting in there, getting my hands dirty, and really trying to, for lack of a better word, perfect the craft. And no, we never perfect it. It's a journey.
Sure.
But trying to get better at it, and got to the point where, around my local neighborhoods and towns here, I was like one of the only home studios at that time that had a reputation, and I had bands in here all the time. And so I did that tracking thing till about 2000. What are we in? 2018 to about 2014 for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. And then I got to the point where, the music business has changed.
Yeah.
The local bands in my area, Connecticut is not a music mecca by any stretch of the imagination. The bands, the technology became where people can do this themselves. So anyone with a $500 laptop and an interface can record music. So therefore, bands why spend money to make a demo when I could record a demo, right? I could do it myself. And the music industry had changed, and it wasn't about selling CDs anymore. It was about putting up MP3s on bands' websites and those kinds of things, and the quality really wasn't as important to them.
Yeah.
And so that market started to dry up, where the bands just simply didn't have the budgets that they once had to come in and spend a weekend or 5 days or whatever recording an album or CD. And so the business model had to shift. And in 2014, I was, I started a little YouTube channel, just, putting up a couple of videos. I had like 50 followers or subscribers, as they call them. And I wasn't really doing this online education thing. And a friend of mine that happens to be pretty close to PreSonus saw one of my videos. I forget which one it was, to be honest. I was doing something in Studio One when that dog came on the market, and they reached out to me and they said, "Wow, you do really good teaching. Have you ever considered doing online education?" Now, I had one video and 50 subscribers, and I don't know anything about teaching, and so we hooked up on Skype. His name, the person I'm referring to, his name is Johnny Geib. He's part of the Home Studio Trainer, who's a good friend of mine. He's actually out in the Chicago area where you're at. He's a big home studio guy, and he says, you really ought to create a course on mixing and recording. I think people would buy it. And I said, well, I don't have a following, and I don't know anything about teaching, and what else do we need in this world on the internet but another video on how to EQ a snare drum? Do we really need the 250,000th video on that? And I said, no one's going to buy this. We went back and forth like this for months, and we became good friends. And he finally convinced me to just make a product. And he had kind of a built-in following of people that he was doing not mixing training, but training around the DAW of Studio One. That's his specialty. He's a mixing engineer, but he's more of the teaching how to use the DAW. And he had a built-in following, and he said if I created this product, he promoted to his following and kind of introduced me to his followers, if you will. So I said, all right. So I started making this little mixing course. Again, I don't know anything about teaching. I just sat down and said, okay, well, if someone was sitting in the control room with me and I was going to teach you how to mix a song, this is how I would do it. And I hit record, and 9 hours later, we were done. It wasn't, I didn't really edit it. It was really a long form. Here it is, the whole kit and caboodle. And I put this thing together, and I said, what am I going to call it? And I was talking with my wife, and we were talking about a name, and she said, well, what is it? I said, well, it's a mixing course, and I'm really kind of teaching beginners because I want it to be easy for people, because when you get into this, when you're a home recording musician and you buy your computer and your interface for the first time, you think that it's easy. And then you realize that this is a craft, right? And people get very overwhelmed very quickly. And so I wanted to try to make it easy for people. And she said, well, why don't you just call it Mixing Made Easy? And I said, oh, and that was the start of the whole Made Easy product line. That was the brand. She came up with the name, and just like that. And I said, oh, Mixing Made Easy rolls right off the tongue. It sounds exactly what it was intended to be. So I said, okay, great. So I put this thing up online to sell. My buddy Johnny in Chicago introduced me to his, my small audience. Wasn't thousands and thousands of people.
Boom.
Maybe,
and that's where it is, right? Yeah.
And that's where it was.
Wow.
And the next thing that happened, all of a sudden, this thing sold like hotcakes. I couldn't believe it. And that was it. That was the start of it. And it was just, we sold, I think in the first weekend, I sold, like 900 videos in the first weekend.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. I was selling them for like, I think $12 or something ridiculous, because I didn't think anybody would buy one, to be honest.
Sure.
And that was really the beginning of the whole home recording the Made Easy series, the Made Easy brand. That was the start of it.
Right on. Well, definitely a winding path, but you're here now, and that's so awesome. So, your site and YouTube channel is called Home Recording Made Easy, and you have these courses on mixing made easy. Now, you wouldn't think this kind of thing would be controversial, but, I've had folks comment on things I've posted, when I've said, oh, here's an easy technique you can use to, I don't know, make get your bass to sound a little fatter, or whatever.
Right.
And then they get angry. They say it's complex. It takes decades to get good at this. It's not easy. I'm a madman for claiming such things.
Yeah.
Why do you think recording and mixing can be made easy?
Well, I think it's like anything, I always equate it to being, because most people that get into this are musicians on some level, right? We all started as a musician, most of us, right?
Sure.
And so I equate it to like learning an instrument. I'm a guitar player, and I said, being a guitar player, depending on what level you want to get to, it's a taught thing. It's a skilled thing. You're not born with some natural talent to be an audio engineer. It's a schooled thing. And, just like being a guitar player, like you mentioned, it is a craft. And if you want to get great at it, it takes lots of years of dedication. But just like being a guitar player, in 2 or 3 lessons, you can teach someone how to strum 2 chords and how to probably play 50 songs that have those 2 chords in them. It's
Right.
not that difficult. Now, once you get those 2 chords and those 50 songs sitting around the campfire under your belt, and now you aspire to be Eddie Van Halen, well, now that's where the work starts to begin.
Sure.
And so I think it can be made easy, that if you could break it down into its simplest form, none of this stuff is all that complicated. The basics, when you talk about mixing, basic level balance, basic panning laws,
Yeah.
basic EQ stuff, basic compression stuff, which I know we'll talk about. Those things can be taught, and it can be taught in a basic way for someone who has little to no experience.
Yeah.
And so you just have to find the right kind of instructor, that can do that. And I've been blessed enough that 90% of my audience are beginners, and I get dozens and literally dozens and dozens of emails a year on people who have picked up my courses, and they say they're absolute beginners. They knew nothing. And when they were done watching my courses, they felt confident enough that they can take their little production, no matter how small or complex their session was, and make it sound good,
Mhm.
make it, and where they were proud enough to share it with their family and friends. And to me, that's where it's at. So I
Yeah.
think it is easy. I mean, I think it can be easy. The beginning stages, you're
Sure.
right. It's a craft, and you're not gonna have a mix like Chris Lord algae on day 1.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Right?
think that's a great answer to that. And I think sometimes it feels like in recording and mixing, there's a bit of what I would call gatekeeping out there, and it can
Yep.
be intimidating for the beginners, because it's you don't know what sidechain compression is. You're never going to understand it. It takes years, takes decades, and it's one of those things where it's not so difficult just to learn how to do it. And then what's great is that once you know the basics, the essentials, the techniques that can help you, then you just keep working on it, iterating, develop your ear, all that good stuff. And
Absolutely.
then next thing you know, years down the line, you're like, man, I'm making stuff that rivals the stuff I like to listen to on the radio or whatever. So
Absolutely.
I think
It takes time.
That's really
It's
good.
like
Yeah.
anything, right? You got to put the time in. You got to put the sweat equity in if you want to get great at it. It's the same thing with anything you want to do in life, and I truly believe that. I don't believe it's something that we're born with. I believe it's taught, and it can be learned. And if you're willing to put the time in, and whatever your definition of success is in the mixing or recording thing, it doesn't really matter whether you just want to learn, or whether you want to do this professionally, or whether you want to do this just to make your own little demos at home for you and in the privacy of your own home. It is absolutely achievable. And especially today with the amount of tools, technology, and instruction that is available for, literally no money. I mean, there's some investment, but nothing like it was 10 or 15 years ago. You can do this. You really can do this, but you do have to sit down and put the time in as well. You just can't take a 2-hour lesson and go, I'm a fantastic mixing engineer, right?
No.
So there is a reality there, but it can be done. I mean,
Right
I'm living proof of it. So
okay, one of the things that gets a lot of people hung up, certainly people just starting out, and then there's also people who maybe want to choose a new DAW, or they want to switch or whatever. If someone's looking to choose that DAW, do you have any advice for one, best way to kind of approach choosing a DAW that works for them? And then 2, advice for learning or getting better in that DAW, making that easier?
yeah, if you've never used a DAW before and you're starting from scratch, I assume that's the angle you're coming from. Then I would say there's a couple of things you want to take a look for. Number one is you want to look for, if you're doing this alone, or if let's say you're in a band and you have bandmates, what kind of DAW are they using? Do you have any friends or other people that are doing recording? What are they using?
Mm-hmm.
Get some recommendations from them. You want to have a support system to help you get through your learning curve. So if you know someone that already uses a DAW, that is successful with it and understand that that's a good step. If you don't have that, I would say, do what most of us do whenever you want to buy anything. Get on YouTube and look at some videos and see, what is out there and what kind of instruction is available to you for free to start.
Yep.
And once you narrow it down, there's really only 3 major DAW companies in my mind right now, right? There's Pro Tools.
Yeah.
There's Cubase. There's Studio One. Oh, and I guess you could say Logic. And there's some other smaller ones, Mix Harris, Mix Bus, and all that stuff. But those are the 4. I would go out to their website, check out their user forum, their community forum if they have them. See, are people active on them? See how many users are there. You just do a little bit of investigation to really find the support system. If you're brand new and you don't know anything about a DAW, you need some instruction, right? So you want to go out there and you want to look and see, well, where do I see most of the activity and the support that I can kind of tap into? And then you kind of go from there. And being someone that has used all of those DAWs that I just mentioned, they're all excellent pieces of software. Once you get one and you start to work with it, stick with it. And don't be so quick to change the DAW, because the DAW itself is nothing more than a glorified tape machine in the digital world. They all sound the same, although people would argue that one sounds better than another. But if you're a beginner, believe me, you can't hear the difference anyway, and neither can I. And I've been doing this for 20 some odd years. They're all the same. They all work fairly much the same. They all have a slightly different workflow, and some might be a little bit more intuitive than others. But find one, pick one, and stick with it and learn it inside and out, and use YouTube and use people like, yourself and people like me. I have entire courses on how to use a specific DAW. I mean, I use PreSonus Studio One. But there are other, all the DAWs will have, the similar kinds of products available. And I would just say that's how I would do it. I would look for people that I know. What are they using? And if you don't have any of those, those people available to you, then, get online and do a little bit of research. But if you pick one of the 4 major ones, you're going to be just fine.
Love that. I think that's really great advice. And yeah, there's so many resources out there, everybody. So if you don't know anything about a DAW and you're looking for your first one, then you can go there. And if you've, been working in a DAW for years, and this does happen, sometimes people want to switch and they're like, you know what, I want to mix it up, or it's not giving me what I want. Literally same advice. Go out there, watch some YouTube videos, download a demo, poke around in it, just take the time. And I think you'll be all right. It's not that overwhelming.
No, it's not.
So, okay, David, what's your best piece of advice for making recording anything, whether it's a vocal, a guitar, a piano, or something else, easy? How can you have a lot of success, doing simple recording? Because some people, they get so overwhelmed just by the idea of, okay, I got to record myself singing. How do I do that?
Same thing. I think you used the word simple. I think people overthink this thing. And the number one thing to getting at the end of the day, a good mix, a good master, whatever it is a good recording. Yeah. And I think the number one thing that I've encountered with people over the years is they want to make for lack of a better word, a crappy recording sound like a professional record. Right. And it doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. And so the recording aspect of it is keep it simple. So, for example, you're saying record an acoustic guitar. Well, you don't need to go out and buy a $4,000 microphone to get a good acoustic guitar sound. You can, right? But you can spend $99 on a microphone and get a good acoustic guitar sound. And you say, well, how do I know what to do? Same thing with the DAW. There are so many videos and instruction out there on what to do, on how to record, for example, that acoustic guitar. And then the thing to do is, you have a simple microphone cable, a simple interface. You get on YouTube, you watch a couple of videos, and you see that it's, there's a lot of common things on how to do that one thing. And then you get in a room and you experiment. And that's how I learned. Learning how to record instruments for real is I spent months in my home studio when I built, just learning how to record stuff, learning what worked, look what didn't work. And what you'll find more times than not, it's really not all that difficult. People make it like it's some kind of magic and some kind of voodoo. It really isn't. I mean, you can make it that way and you can get some really cool, interesting sounds and stuff, and you can do some more advanced kind of concepts and techniques. But for the basics, you get a microphone, you stick it in front of the sound source and you record it. And there's some basic guidelines, don't record things too hot and what should the levels be. But those are all easy things to understand. And then it's about just recording something, sitting down, listening to it. You like what you hear? You don't like what you hear? What don't you like? Go back, move the microphone 6 inches to one side, record it, sit down, listen, and rinse and repeat, and keep going through that process. And what you'll find is you'll figure out with your guitar in your room, with your microphone, in your environment, what is the right way to do it? Because there is no one way to do any of this stuff. If it was, we'd all be excellent audio engineers, right? There's so many
one book.
Yeah, there'd be one book, and we'd all read it, and that would be it. But there's not. So it's keep it simple so you don't get overwhelmed. When I say watch YouTube videos and don't watch too many YouTube videos. You'll spend your whole life watching YouTube videos. If you can watch 400 videos and get 400 different ways to record that acoustic guitar, watch a couple, get a basic concept, and you have to go do. And some of this stuff is you gotta get in there, get your hands dirty, and you gotta try things. And that's my best advice is just keep it simple. Don't make it harder than it needs to be, because it really isn't that difficult. Again, when we're talking about just getting a good sound recording that sounds good. Again, is it going to sound like a commercial record? Not right out of the gate. It's not going to. Those are much more advanced techniques, skills, microphones, all those things. But just to get something that sounds good, it's really not that complicated,
Sure. And I love that advice too. The part where you're talking about, just put the mic there, point it at the source, and then go back and listen to it. And then if you like it, great. If you don't, well, move the mic 6 inches, and then try again. That's something that I often recommend that people do, even if they like the first recording that they did. Do it anyway. Maybe move it and redo it. That way, you have two options, and you can choose between them. Because I think there's a power of choice there to get you even better results. But bottom line. Yeah. It's that simple. It doesn't need to be like, oh, there's some crazy technical way that I need to put this microphone. A lot of people, some of the best recordings, you even recording engineers who obviously have tons of experience, but I've talked to them and they're like, what do? I just take it and I stick the mic there and I'm like, all right, let's try that. And then I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll grab this mic. Let's stick there. That's okay. And that's what they do.
Yeah. And you'll start to learn over time that, going back to that acoustic guitar example, you'll learn that, okay, on this particular acoustic guitar, maybe it's a more entry-level guitar. It's not the sound, the build quality and stuff is not as good. This one microphone sounds a certain way if I point it at the sound hole. And then the next guitar that I bring in is a $4,000 Martin, and I use a different microphone and I point it in a completely opposite angle because on that particular guitar, it sounds better. And you'll start to learn those things over time. And that you're exactly right. It's really, you point it at the sound source and you try it. There's some basic guidelines you want to adhere to from recording levels and those kinds of things. But after that, it really isn't. And if you go online and you watch, go search out Eddie Kramer or Chris Lord-Alge, any one of these, any recording engineer that you know of, all the big names, and go watch. They have all kinds of videos. How do I mic up my electric guitar cabinet? They all do it in the same kind of way. There's slight differences and they may combine different microphones and stuff, but the basic concepts of what they're doing is all the same. And so when you see a couple of those, you go, oh, well, I can do that too. I can stick the microphone in front of the cabinet. How hard is that?
Yeah.
And I don't mean to diminish and say, well, any idiot can do this. I'm just saying that it is simpler than a lot of people make it sound. It really is.
I think that's the key. And then I think the difference between, maybe someone who's just starting or someone who, is a titan of the industry is that, they've developed their ear. They have, they are maybe more instinctual about exactly what microphone they want to reach for. Depending on the situation and all that kind of stuff. So there is talent that develops and skill. But the point is don't feel like if you don't have that from the word go that you can't get any quality recording, because you can.
Absolutely.
So okay, you've got this recorded. The next thing is, mixing. And this, a lot of people get intimidated by this and they think that, no, it can't be easy.
uh, how can someone simplify their mixing process or avoid getting bogged down with jargon and the complex techniques? There's because and this is a risk. If you go on YouTube, you'll get some guy who's like, all right, so here's how I sidechain this compressor, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then someone's there like,
Yeah.
So how do you make mixing easy?
Well, step one is the biggest thing I see, people get all hung up on the plugins.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone thinks you need to buy the latest and greatest vintagey LA2A stylish thing to make. Stay with your stock plugins, with your whatever DAW you buy. Doesn't matter which one it is.
Sure.
And the two plugins that you need to understand as best as you possibly can, and you'll never master it all at once, because even I and you haven't mastered it yet, is EQ and compression. EQ being the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Understand how an EQ works. Understand how to effectively use it. That is the greatest tool you have in your toolbox to getting a mix, the sound balanced and with clarity. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can learn how to use EQ and compression even somewhat effectively, just your stock EQ and compressor, and learn some basic things about panning, and that's where it all kind of starts. That's 70% of the lifting in my mind to making a good mix. So again, start small. Start at the beginning. I mean, one of the things we talked about was the course that we're gonna give away, which would being the link, which is Mixing Made Easy Volume 1. That's exactly what that course is. I think it's 10 hours long over several videos. I don't know the exact time, but it's lengthy, and it's only mixing a song with stock plugins. And I taught it from a beginner's perspective. There's no advanced techniques in there. There's not even the word sidechain ever spoken because you don't need that. And so it's just like anything. Mixing is a process, and there's a set of guidelines, just like recording. And then there's not a whole lot of rules after that. You could kind of do whatever you want, and there's no one way to do it. But you need to understand the basic fundamentals, and that's what that video series that we're going to give away to your listeners will do for them.
Right on. All right, so let's dive into maybe some more specific techniques here, and pieces of advice you might have. So let's start with compression, because I know that is something that's really, EQ is such an important tool, and compression is kind of like the sister tool as well.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, EQ is maybe easier to grasp and start like really working with than compression. Seems like it gets a lot of people, wringing their hands. So
Right.
do you have any tips or techniques for getting just better results with compression? Do you have any moves that you like to make that seem to work really well with your mixes, and they aren't, some overly complex thing involving multiple compressors going yada yada yada?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, the first point that you made is people have an easier time with EQ because you can hear the audible difference in EQ. I mean, even any novice, you could take an EQ, you can boost up a frequency, at 5K, and you can hear the result. It may not sound good, but you can hear it. The reason why compression is more difficult is because most beginners, and even intermediate people, they can't hear compression. They don't know what to listen for. It's the one thing that it's like a mysterious thing in the ether, this thing called compression. And they put the compressor on and they see the gain reduction meter happen and they go, I don't hear anything. And that's the key. So, and what most beginners do is they overcompress everything to death, because when you overcompress, you could hear the audible difference more times than not. So my piece of advice is use compressors, and this is a general statement, of course, this doesn't apply to everything, in a very sparing way. Most of my courses that I teach, I use the phrase controlled compression, meaning it's done in very, very small amounts across different things. So, for example, I could be mixing a snare drum. Okay, so we're putting compression on a snare drum in a very small amount, maybe 2 dB of compression at a 2-to-1 ratio. From that snare drum is now going to a drum bus. Okay, that bus has a compressor on it. Again, very light amount of compression. From the bus, it's going to a master bus. And on that master bus, there's probably a tape machine, which is a compressor on some level. There's probably a mix bus compressor on some level. And then there's probably a limiter, which is really a compressor. And so now what you've done is you've compressed that snare in different stages 5 different times. And that doesn't include if you're using things like console emulators and vintage tape machines and all of that, you can be running that snare signal through 6 or 7 different forms of compression in a mix.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do it in very small doses, it keeps the music to retain its dynamics, and it doesn't squash everything to death and make things sound flat and muddy.
Yeah.
So when you're first learning with compression, the very first thing I try to tell people is, again, you got to understand the basic functions of a compressor, of your stock compressor, and all compressors are laid out a little different. And I have a whole course called Compression Made Easy if you want to learn the most basic forms of compression at the absolute beginner level. Compression Made Easy is the course for you, where we look at all that stuff. But then you just want to do things in a very sparing way. Don't over compress things. And also, you'll start to learn as we get more into the course, there's lots of times I don't compress things at all.
Mm-hmm.
There's everyone just assumes you need to put a compressor on everything. And what I try to teach in my courses is there has to be a purpose for using these plugins like compression. If you don't know why you're compressing, don't compress. If you don't listen to a piece of audio and say, and you don't have a thought in your head on what you want that audio to sound like, then just don't put a compressor on there because you saw your favorite engineer on YouTube put a compressor on his snare drum.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't always need it. It depends. So again, I guess the answer to your question is do it in small doses. Under compress is better than over compress when you're starting out. Okay. Don't squash the thing to death to where there's no dynamics left in the music. And then when you're talking about more of an advanced thing, I think you asked about the other, like one of my moves that I try to do, and this is more of an advanced technique, is parallel compression.
Yeah.
And not just parallel compression on the drums, which is where it's mostly commonly used, where they smash the drums. And then I do it on all the groupings of instruments. So when I'm doing a client mix, and again, not every mix, because not every mix needs it, but more times than not, doing parallel compression on your drums, your bass, your guitars, your keys, your horns, your vocals, your background vocals, on and then taking those separate parallel compressed tracks and tucking them in underneath the original buses gives a lot of thickness and girth to the music, but it doesn't sound flat because you still have the original tracks that have all the dynamics in it. Because along those tracks, we do this thing that I called control compression. So I have some YouTube videos on that. And I also, Mixing Made Easy Volume 2, which is the more advanced course, I spend, I think, an hour and a half talking about that entire concept and showing it in detail. So
right on. I love that advice. I think I have this audio tip of the week, and a number of shows back, I discussed parallel compression because it is so powerful,
so effective.
Yeah, and it's a great way to get what you want out of compression while literally protecting yourself from over compressing it, because if you're compressing in parallel, you still have that original signal that's not getting slammed. So that's really key. So, okay. EQ, we were just talking about compression. People can hear the differences with their EQ more easily than compression, but still some people, maybe have trouble with what are the best moves or should I boost? Should I cut? How much? How wide should I set it? How narrow? What the cue? What should I do there? Do you have any advice or tips for getting good results with EQ? How do you achieve the balance and the separation between tracks and all these kinds of things? Obviously, that's a long question, but do you have any quick tips?
The thing is that every source is different. So I always get asked questions about EQ settings, and I never give them out because there are no EQ settings for any specific thing. There's now, again, like I've talked, there's a set of guidelines. And if there's, again, we'll go back to that snare drum, there's a set of fundamental frequencies and a kind of go-to places when a snare doesn't sound right that you can kind of check. But there are no two snare drums made the same or played the same. And so the EQ curve is going to be different all the time. As far as, as far as a simple tip, you want to think about cutting before boosting. And assuming now that you have tracks that are fairly well recorded, because that's the key to all of this, but assuming the tracks are pretty, well recorded, If you're finding yourself boosting on every single track, especially anything over about 3K, and every single EQ curve has a ton of top end on it, there's something wrong. And so you probably means that you have a lot of low end buildup that you're not cutting, which makes you think you need to boost the high end. And when you do that across the mix, it sounds like at the end of the day, it'll end up sounding like nails on a chalkboard. So you want to think about cutting before boosting. You want to, again, understand what a fundamental frequency is, for a specific instrument or sound source. And again, I have all that stuff on my website as well. And there's others that have it as well. And again, keep it simple. If the tracks are recorded well, and again, I always go back to that because that is really the key, especially when you're starting out. I tell people when you're starting out mixing and you don't have any, say, tracks of your own, try to get a hold of some halfway decent multi-tracks. And there's lots of free websites out there that you could download multi-tracks. There's services and there's membership sites like you have and I have that you can get really high quality recordings to practice your mixing chops on. So you don't have to deal with the crappy recording and trying to fix a bad recording, that you can just start with a well-recorded track and learn from there. What you'll find is that there shouldn't be a lot of major EQ moves if things are recorded well. There's going to be some, and there's going to be a little bit of cutting and a little bit of boosting, but there's not going to be these massive EQ moves. If there are, then you're probably not thinking about it in the right way. And you're probably making the track sound worse than better, and you just don't realize it. And so that's what I would say. I'd say think about cutting instead of boosting. Keep it simple, and understand what each instrument has as far as their fundamental frequencies. And there's all kinds of EQ guides and charts and things that you can find, I'm sure, on your website as well as mine, that kind of point you in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really great advice. And I think I also would add to that, earlier you mentioned about, why are you compressing, and people compressing just because they think they have to and they don't have a goal in mind or a reason. And that's the same with EQ.
Sure.
You don't necessarily need to boost something or cut something. If you don't just necessarily just need to, fire it up and I'm just making an EQ curve. I'm just doing this. Know when that's not needed. And when you maybe don't need to do all sorts of crazy things, and you have a goal in mind, because I think where people get in trouble is when they just kind of start, adding plugins and doing this and doing that. And they aren't really thinking, okay, what are these tools designed to do? And what am I even trying to accomplish here? Am I trying to get rid of some mud? Okay, well, if you're doing that, then maybe you need to start doing some cutting. Okay. But if you're just, oh, okay, yeah, I'm just gonna roll all this off, then it's like, well, now you might end up with a thin recording that doesn't sound good and doesn't sound full or whatever. So
so it's about, I think, doing it with a purpose. I always say, and in a lot of my different series, when I go through those stages, I'll say, okay, what are we looking to achieve? And that's why my series, all my products are, people say I'm crazy. I mean, they're 8, 10 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours long. And the reason why they're that long is because I don't show you the after. I take you from the very beginning and we go through the process. So I don't mix a song and then show you what I did. For a beginner, there is absolutely no learning there. I take you and we do it together, and I'll add, the way you and I are talking right now, I'm talking to the screen like I'm talking to an imaginary person. I'm talking to the camera going, okay, we heard that electric guitar. What do you hear? And I'll ask the question, you should be answered. What do you hear? What do you like? What don't you like? Well, here's what I hear. And this is what I would do. And this is why I would do it. So I spend an enormous amount of time in my courses going over the why. Because that is the thing that I think is missing in a lot of the courses that I've seen out online. They teach you what they did, and they taught you that you can use, 400 plugins in a session, and look how cool this is, and look at all the things I did. And you get back to what you mentioned earlier, which is people then get overwhelmed. And they go, oh my Lord, I don't have all these plugins, and I'm going to spend $500,000 to buy these plugins. And, and it just looks like it looks impressive on the screen, but it completely hits the student like a tidal wave, and they get so frustrated they don't even know what they're listening to anymore. And so, to me, it's more important that they understand the why. And that's why my series are just so long. You will never find any one of my Made Easy products that are an hour or 90 minutes long. They don't exist. The shortest one I think is EQ Made Easy, and that's 4 hours. The longest one is the most recent one I did, and it's 14 hours. And it's because I really try to make sure you understand what we're doing. The plugin doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're using a stock plugin or some $400 vintage UA plugin. It's the concept that you need to get through your head, right? And as we just said, okay, why do we want to EQ? What don't I like about that guitar? Oh, it sounds a little thin. Okay, now I know, okay, thin, what does that mean? Okay, we're going to go here. Let's listen to that. Let's A-B it on and off. Does it sound better? Does it sound worse? If it sounds worse, don't do that. And it's really, that's how I teach these courses, just in that way.
For sure. So I'm curious if you have any advice for folks on workflow. A lot of people sit down to mix specifically and they don't know where to start, or they get stuck and frustrated, or, they spend hours on end messing with that snare. They're trying to EQ that snare and they're just still unhappy. Where do you recommend folks, start their mixes? And do you have any advice for, the order of mixing and their workflow in general?
Yeah, I mean, there's no rules here, but I mean, I the way I do most of my mixing, if we're talking about, rock, pop rock, drums, bass, guitar, vocal type music, I usually start with the drums, and I usually build the sound around that. You don't have to do it that way, but that's kind of how I just grew up doing it, and that kind of works for me. So I start with, after we do a static mix, which is, we talk about later if you like, but I start with the kick drum. Okay, let's process the kick. Let's process the snare. Then we just work right down the drum kit and then move over to the bass. And then once I got the drums and the bass kind of together, then I start building in the rest of the instruments around it. The one tip that I'll give is once you get the kick drum done, that should be the only track that you do in solo. So in other words, once the kick is the way you want it to sound and you bring in the snare, you want to keep the kick unmuted. You want to listen to the kick. You want the snare to sound good with the kick drum, because the snare doesn't do any good in solo if it doesn't sound good when it's in the kick drum. Now, again, you can solo things and we check things. And when I teach it in solo because I want them to hear only that one thing and not be distracted by the other stuff going on around it. But I always talk about that as you get a little more beyond the absolute beginner, to do things that are not in solo. Try to do things in the context of a mix. It's hugely important, because a good snare drum that's EQ'd and compressed perfectly on its own doesn't mean it's going to sound good when the rest of the drum kit is playing.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
So, okay, only have a couple more questions here.
Sure.
Now, this is a good question, because I think we've been kind of dancing around it, but I always like to emphasize this. Some people have equipment that isn't the most expensive, or maybe they don't have super high-end monitors, or, they don't have that $3,000 microphone because, they need to eat.
Yeah, right.
What advice do you have for folks to get the best results when they're recording and mixing and they're on a budget, and they're limited with what, they can't go and give Steve Slate their kidney,
Right.
So what advice do you have for them to get the best results?
Well, again, start with the cheap stuff. I mean, some of the biggest records you've ever heard, the vocals were recorded on a $99 Shure SM57. And an engineer told me this once. He said, if you can't record an entire record with an SM57, which is a $99 microphone, for people who don't know, it's a studio staple that, you've seen for 100 years. If you can't record an entire record and make it sound good with an SM57, then you need to rethink what you're doing. And I learned that, and I took that to heart, and I've challenged myself to do just that many times in my career. And you can do things with a $99 microphone. You really, really can. And again, it's about experimentation, and it's about limitations in the beginning stages are better than having more choices.
Yeah.
Because when you have the limitation and you can't reach for 10 different microphones, that's 9 other things that don't need to distract you. Right. So, I mean, as I mentioned, Michael Jackson, Bono from U2, Prince, all three of them, James Hetfield from Metallica, have all recorded a vocal on an album with an SM57. Look it up and Google it. It's true. Um,
Yep.
and those, could you put a $4,000 microphone in front of Michael Jackson? Absolutely. Would it sound maybe 10% better than an SM57? Absolutely. But the end user, the person that's consuming the music, the non-musician that's listening to the final mix, do they have any idea what that vocal was recorded on? And does it matter?
No, sir.
No.
No, sir.
And if you think about it that way, and that's part of the problem with the beautiful part about where the time we live in is that there's so much gear and there's so much, it's so accessible to all of us, and a lot of it at a very reasonable price considering the
Yeah.
time that we're in. The bad news is there's so much gear and there's so many choices that you mentioned it in your question. People get so overwhelmed, they don't know what to do. And if you go watch a bunch of YouTube videos, you got to be careful because you're going to see 100 guys do it 100 different ways. And some people are going to tell you need to have this or you need to have that. I'm telling you that you don't need to have any of that stuff. You need to have an SM57 or an SM58, the $99 microphone. You need a decent microphone cable, and you need really no more than a $100 audio interface and some computer, and you can make something that sounds pretty darn good. And I would even argue, if you really know what you're doing in the recording and mixing stages, you can have a professional sounding record. You
For sure.
absolutely can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. And actually, one thing that's just kind of came to me that I want to mention, you were mentioning Prince, Michael Jackson, these titans who have recorded with an SM57. I think another key too is really helps to have a good song. So
absolutely. Yeah.
So if you have a good song that is, well written and, and you're a pretty decent player, if you are playing guitar or whatever, those are things that are going to help you and help the track sound a lot better than if you went out and you spent $4,000 on that microphone. Because if you record a junk song with a crummy guitar player on a $4,000 microphone, but then you get Michael Jackson on a $100 microphone, guess which one's going to sound better?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I always go back to the Beatles, right? Go back to the early recordings of the 60s and stuff where all this crazy technology wasn't there.
Yeah.
And they all got in a room and they had wonderful songs and they were good players. And in those days, they would all get in a room, in a live room together. To be a handful of microphones hanging around the room. And what you heard on the floor is what was on the record.
How many tracks did they have?
Yeah, 4 if they were lucky. I think when they got 8, it was like, they didn't know what to do with themselves by the time they got to 8 tracks. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really about simplicity, and it's really about everyone says this cliche term, get it right at the source, but it is very true. You got to have a good song. You have to have it well arranged, and then you have to record it well. It doesn't mean you have to use expensive gear. It just means you need to have some basic recording techniques and some understanding of how to capture a sound. And once you have that, the mix mixes itself. Yep. You shouldn't have to put a ton of plugins. When I mix a song, and I do this a lot in my series and learning to mix and all the things that you see me do mixing, teaching, most of what I'm doing is done with less than a handful of plugins. Now, some people will see the session and they'll go, wow, it looks like you got a lot of plugins, because I'm using like a tape machine on every single track, a console emulator on every single track, which is a little bit more advanced technique, but that's just more of a color and a tone. That's not fixing anything. That's just passing signal through something to kind of warm it up a little bit. But as far as EQ and compression is concerned, which is where most of the sculpting is taking place, it's very minimal. It really, really is. It's more about if you have a good track and it's a good song and it's well recorded, the song kind of mixes itself.
Yeah,
you should be able to open up a session, not put a single plugin on, and you'll see this in Mixing Made Easy Volume 1. Put all the faders up and start to balance them, and it ought to be 75% there. And if it is, then if you like the way it sounds without a single plugin on it, you're kind of bopping your head to the music, you're going, yeah, this is sounding pretty good. Then you have a good song and you have a well-recorded song, and now it's about just kind of sweetening it and dialing it into taste and doing some more of the advanced things that maybe make it sound a little interesting and special. But at its core, It's a simple song that's, that's recorded well. And then the mixing isn't all that difficult,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, my last question. A lot of people get frustrated and they get stuck when it comes to songwriting, recording, mixing. They aren't happy with what they're doing, they can't finish projects, or they're just completely lost.
Yeah.
And I see this. I get emails from, the audio skills community, and I'm sure you do, where there's people who are, I'm unhappy. I sent an email out this week talking about how to have success. And what I was talking about was how you define success and all these kinds of things. But,
Right.
There's still people that are they're just stuck. They're frustrated and they can't break through. What advice might you have to help someone in that situation? Could be philosophical advice, I don't know, but how can they break through?
Well, I mean, the good news is if you're frustrated and you are unhappy at times with what you hear, that's a good thing. You want to know why?
Mhm.
Because you're willing, your mind is open that you're on the journey. If you're listening to your stuff and if you could, I don't know about you, Scott, but I know me. I listen to stuff today, and I'm never 100% happy with anything that I turn out.
Oh,
I've always known that
yeah.
I can get better, right? Because us as engineers and stuff, we're geeks, right? And we want that perfect snare drum or that perfect vocal and stuff. But again, I'm always thinking about the end user. Most of the end users couldn't tell you the difference between any of this stuff. Does it sound good or doesn't it sound good? And we get way down in the weeds. That's what we do. And so people that are listening to this, that are recording their own stuff, you're always going to have something you wish you did better. And that's a good thing, because that means that you have the mindset that you want to continue to get better and you want to learn. As far as tips, how do you break through that? Is I love deadlines. I love stopwatches. What I mean by that is I still to this day run on my iPhone here. I run a stopwatch. I allow myself a typical song that doesn't have 100 tracks in it, 4 hours to mix a song. Now,
Wow, I love that.
sometimes it takes 5, sometimes it takes 3, but 4 hours is where I need to be almost done. That keeps me from spending an hour on a snare drum.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you limit yourself and you give yourself a deadline, like if you're a songwriter and I just can't get the song finished, get the song finished, put it out, whatever that means to you. The next one will be better. You gotta know when to stop. I work with students all the time that they'll mix a song for a month. You got to be kidding me. You'll listen to that mix and because you're so close to the music, especially if it's your own music, you will always find something that you're not happy with. Your ears will always trick you into thinking something, it could be a little better. I don't like this. I liked this yesterday. How come I didn't like that today? It could be one of them different million reasons. You have to know when to stop. And so deadlines, stopwatches, all those things are good. And you have to finish something and you're going to say, you know what? I'm not 100% happy with it. Maybe I'm 75% happy. Maybe I'm 50% happy. But the next one, I'm going to be 5% more happy because whatever I did on this project, I learned something and I'm going to take that to my next project. And it's, again, I go right back to what we said in the very first question, which was, it's just like learning an instrument. You don't learn how to play like Eddie Van Halen on lesson 1. You spend 10 years getting a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And then when you go back and listen to the stuff that you did in the very beginning, you're going to go, oh my God, I can't believe that I did that stuff. I do that today. I can listen to a mix from 2 years ago and go, oh boy, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
And this is after doing this for 20 years. So that's not a bad thing. So if you're frustrated and if you're stuck, that's actually a good thing, because if you weren't that, I'd be worried that either you just didn't care about it enough or you were closed-minded to the point where you thought it was so great right out of the box that you couldn't learn anything new.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would just say limit yourself, force yourself to finish, give yourself a deadline and manage yourself to those deadlines.
I love that. I'd say I have 2 things to add to that. One, reiterating the deadline thing. I think the other challenge that people have is, especially if you're working in a home studio and you aren't paying for that studio time and you don't have those constraints, it can get really easy to just take forever. So artificial deadlines, a stopwatch, scheduling like a specific time, like, okay, I'm going to have a recording session on Wednesday at 7 p.m. after work. And I'm going to make that, and I'm going to work for, 2 hours on the recording, and that's all I got, because then I got to go take the dog out,
Right.
things like that. So absolutely. I've also, I've talked to so many engineers who take clients, and they say one of the best things about that has helped them get better as mixing engineers is the fact that they have clients, because they have to deliver the product. It's like, well, I got to finish this mix. So if not necessarily, if you are not taking a client, that's fine, but have that mentality of, well, I've got to finish this mix, as though you're the client, you're your own client. So that's really key.
And you have to turn it out. Yeah,
exactly. And then the last thing I'll say with in terms of, if you're frustrated, that being a good thing, I agree 100%. I took a creative writing course a number of years back, and the person who was teaching it, he mentioned, what's the difference between a writer and someone who's just kind of not, an amateur or whatever. The writer writes his first draft and says, "This is terrible. I'm off to a great start." Whereas the amateur says, "This is terrible," and then doesn't do anything. Right. And then says, "Oh, that's it." So if you are listening to your mix and you're frustrated and you're like, that it's just the drums are not right. Okay. File that away. And then maybe next time you say, okay, what did I do with those drums? How did I compress them? What kind of EQ moves was I making? What was my process there? And then try to make a little change or do something different, watch a YouTube video, try a different technique, whatever it is. And then, just keep working, get that output going, because I think it's like you said, David, someone working on a mix for a month, that's too long.
That's insane. Too long. Yeah, I couldn't do that. The other thing you brought up a thought is, you're right. Watch a YouTube video, get some training. I tell a lot of my students and prospective students, you have to, if you really want to do this, you have to invest in your craft. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean? You have to go out and invest time and or some money sometimes in learning and getting better, training. Whether it's through your website, whether it's through my website, whether it's through the one of the billion other people out there that are teaching audio and all the different concepts and techniques, you have to be willing to not only put the time in, but sometimes put your money, where your mouth is, and you got to be willing to make an investment to find an instructor or some training to help you take that drum recording, as you just mentioned, to the next level, because you may not be happy with the way those drums sound, and you may not understand why, and that's where the teaching comes in. And,
Absolutely.
And again, you regardless of whether you purchase my products or whether you go to Audio Skills or anywhere else, you have to, sample some stuff, like a tasting, like food tasting, find the instructor that kind of relates to you, find the instructor that you kind of jive with, or you can learn from. We all learn differently. And, someone may take one of your lessons, Scott, and get a lot more out of it than if I taught the same course, because they related to your style of teaching, or vice versa. And once you find that, be willing to, to put in some time and sometimes a few bucks into it, because that's the only way you're going to get better. I mean, because you're not going to learn this stuff from the ether. You have to get instruction from someone. And YouTube's a great resource because it's free. The thing I worry about YouTube, and I get more and more concerned about YouTube as it gets more popular is, it used to be when you were starting, Scott, and when I was starting, 15, 20 years ago, there was no YouTube, right? And so if you wanted to learn this, you had to go spend the time and money and develop a craft. And over time, you put your experience in, and you're able now to teach other people. Today, in the world of YouTube, unfortunately, anyone with a $500 laptop and an interface can call themselves an audio engineer. And there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. And you got to be careful about that too. I see a lot of people, I watch a lot of YouTube videos about this craft because I like to stay on top of what's going on. And it's astonishing to me how many people really don't know what they're talking about. And they're not, and they teach and tell people the wrong things and put them in the wrong direction. And
Yeah.
you alluded to that earlier, where you have to have this, or you have to have that, or you got to have this side chain thing and 14 compressors on a vocal track to make it sound right. You know, you got to be careful about that. You have to try to go to, you know, reliable, well-known people in the circles, you know, read reviews, you know, read testimonials, find people that really know what they're talking about, you know, because that'll help cut down your learning curve tremendously, because you won't be sent down some rabbit hole for the next 2 years and come to find out you're no better at the craft than you were 2 years ago, because you're not getting the right learning material. And that's important. And that's super important. And so I do all the time. I've had people, you know, try my course for the first time. And if, you know, they liked it or didn't, they'd say, you know, I want to try something else. I've recommended other teachers to them, you know, my competition, because to me, there's so much opportunity out there that if my style of teaching isn't for you, well, I could tell you 4 other people that teach in a different way that I do, that I respect in the industry. Try one of their courses. Maybe you'll click with that instructor a little bit better, and it'll help you on your journey. I do that for people all the time. I'm not trying to say my courses are the best. No, my courses are the best to some people. To other people, maybe they're not, because maybe my style of teaching doesn't resonate with you. You know what I mean? So, and it's all good. It's all good. You know, the way I look at it.
For sure. And one other thing I'd add about the risks of YouTube is that a lot of people, you know, it's helpful to have a complete picture of, you know, what you were talking about, of like a mix from start to finish, or to have like a consistent idea of like, okay, this is what the instructor does. This is how they work through the song, and this is the techniques they use. I think I see a lot of people kind of, you know, I'm going to watch this guy on this YouTube video do this thing with an EQ, and I'm going to watch this guy on this YouTube video do this thing with a compressor, and then this guy's doing this, and you know, he's working on a completely different song than this person, and
right.
blah, blah, blah. And that kind of, because that's something when I was you know, starting out, I tried to watch some YouTube videos, and I was like, whoa, because there's so much different perspectives and techniques and things like that. And you can easily kind of get lost with if you're trying to piece together an education that way. So
yeah, I know a lot of people that buy lots of courses from lots of different people, and they buy so many training courses, and they never have the time to watch any of them. You know,
yeah.
They spend all this money. I've had people, it's funny. So I've had people that have bought my courses, and 2 years later ask me, you know, they never watched the course, but then they wanted to re-download it again. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. I'm like, well, why did you spend the money if you had no intentions on watching the course? I mean, if you're going to, don't buy all these buy a course, right? Go through one. And if you like that teacher, if you like that instructor, you learn something valuable from that course, then try the next course from that instructor. If not, search out another instructor and try the same thing. And you will eventually find the resources that you need that are really, really helpful. But just like with all the equipment and all the plugins and everything we've been talking about, you could get very overwhelmed with the amount of instruction that's out there. I mean, there's mountains of it. It's all over the place. And I would say that the majority of it is not all that great, but the 25 or 30% that is really, really good. And it's all the names that, you know, it's your website. It's, you know, it's the guys over at Recording Revolution and Home Studio Corner. I mean, all the names that we all know, these are all great instructors, and they all have something really great to offer. You just got to find what resonates with you. That's all. And it's just no different. Again, I'll go right back to where we said in the beginning. It's just like going to take guitar lessons. You know, there's lots of guitar teachers, and some you can learn from and progress really quickly on the instrument, and some you just don't click with for whatever reason. It doesn't mean they're not good at what they do. It just didn't resonate with you. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to find what resonates with you.
Absolutely. Well, David, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really informative, and really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, no, thanks. I really appreciate the exposure, and I commend you on what you're doing, and you're doing a lot of what I do. In fact, that, you know, you're taking someone that on some level is one of your competitors, and you're trying to share that information with other people. And I think that's really cool. Not a lot of people do that. You know what I mean? They get very insecure about, oh, I'm going to bring someone on my show that does kind of some of the same things that I do. You know, am I going to lose, you know, business that way? And again, I applaud you for doing that and exposing your listeners to to people that other people in the industry that kind of maybe do some of what you do on some level, because I think there's lots of opportunity for all of us. And I think that's just a really cool thing to do. And not a lot of people do that. And so I thank you for, bringing me on your show and letting your listeners, find out about me.
Oh, for sure, man. Well, I think it's back to what you were saying. I want people to learn and I want them to get better. And, if I can help them do that, great. If you can help them do that, great. If we both can help them, even better,
Right.
So
Right on.
I think that's what it's all about. And kind of speaking to that, we mentioned it earlier, but you've got a video course, Mixing Made Easy Volume 1, that we're going to be giving away for free for anyone's listening. You want to listen to it or you want to watch it and learn directly from David. It's an awesome course, and we're going to have a link to that on the Audio Skills show notes page for this episode. So, after you listen to this, go over there and you can click through. Is there anything else you want to mention about it, David?
No, when they click on the link, it'll bring them right to the website, and they can they'll be able to go ahead and download the product. You can stream it as well, but I always recommend that people download it just because, depending on your internet connection and that kind of thing. I think that series is probably 8 or 10 videos long, so it does take some time to download, and all the audio files come with it. So you're actually going to mix the song with me. You have that opportunity. I give you all the audio files. And so, take the time, let it download. And then, go through it and let me know what you guys thought. If you like it, if you didn't like it, I welcome all feedback on it.
Absolutely. And I wanted to thank you all so much for listening today. And as a reminder, for links and information about today's show and our guest, as well as that link to the course, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast. No matter where you are, what kind of music you're making, what you're working on, just go out there and make it great.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.